Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our event here today. I'd like to give a welcome to our distinguished speakers and our guest. Welcome to our global webinar event titled Navigating the Climate Nuclear Nexus, the Climate Crisis and Nuclear War. Now, this event is hosted by Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Tokyo, or YPFP, and the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and the Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability Fellowship. My name is Tristan Norman, and I am a Programs Officer at Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Tokyo, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's event. I would like to give a warm welcome and thank you to ICAN, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, 1.2 Degrees of Peace, the 50%, and all the other supporters who helped us promote and share this event. Now, before we hear from our esteemed speakers, I would like to share a few administrative guidelines. First, today's speaker will be speaking in English. Also, if you have any questions for our speakers, we encourage you to share them in the chat below. We will have some time later for a Q&A session. Additionally, today's session will be recorded, so we welcome active participation from our guest. Finally, through our events, we aim to promote an environment of trust where we build understanding on complex issues through intergenerational, and inclusive dialogue. We kindly ask that all distinguished presenters and guests respect differences in culture, experience, and perspective, regardless of the topics being discussed. Please note that this event will operate under Chatham House rule, which means that participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers, nor that of any participant may be revealed. We'd like to give thank you for the kind attention to these points. But before I introduce today's moderator, I would like to take this opportunity to share a few remarks about YPFP Tokyo, the organization hosting today's event. YPFP is a global organization that has been working for nearly 20 years to build the next generation of diverse and passionate leaders through career-building programs, engaging events with global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate voices through research, writing, and publication. Tokyo is the newest YPFP branch, connecting people from around the world for those who are interested in Asia. YPFP Tokyo is a youth-led and youth-focused NGO dedicated to nurturing the next generation of foreign policy leaders, with a particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Now, our work is broad and inclusive, and our programming is organized into three main streams. The first being sustainability, climate innovation. Second, international relations and human rights. Third, security and defense. Now, within these streams, we seek and create spaces for intellectual growth and research, open dialogue and co-leadership, networking and partnerships at the local, regional, and global levels. As the newest hub of YPFP Global Network, we welcome support, participation, and innovative ideas from among leaders and changemakers. Now, as a youth-focused organization based in Japan, we remembered the strong humanitarian cost of nuclear weapons and the lives lost at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At last year's G7 meeting in Hiroshima, world leaders discussed the need for a world without nuclear weapons and the current nuclear threats facing our world today with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, progress towards nuclear disarmament and this big goal has been slow. Now, to rekindle this vision, we hope to connect nuclear disarmament together with the climate crisis as the two important challenges facing our shared futures. Japan especially has a unique role to play, as do young people around Japan. For today's webinar, we will hear from 4 speakers and experts active in the climate nuclear nexus, followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A after the conclusion of all the speakers' remarks. Please use the chat function to ask questions and direct them to us, and we will direct them to the speaker during the session. Next, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Nivedita. Nivedita is a research fellow at the National Union of Singapore Center for International Law and part of the Basic Emerging Voices Network. She was the co-chair of a working group on nuclear weapons issues and climate change as part of a Basic Emerging Voices Network's policy cycle focused on de-siloing existential threats. Nivedita will now briefly introduce our speakers to kick off today's discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Tristan, for the kind introduction. Once again, a very warm welcome, everyone, to this important webinar that touches on a key topic relating to the climate nuclear nexus. As Tristan mentioned, this webinar is really targeted at the youth, a key stakeholder class that is at the heart of this nexus. We have an exciting lineup of speakers who I will introduce very briefly, bearing in mind the time that we have. Our first speaker is Michael T. Klare, who serves as a senior visiting fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., and a defense correspondent for The Nation. He's also the Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and author of 15 books, including Resource Wars, The Race for What's Left, and more recently, All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Our second speaker is Ira Helfand, MD, who's a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN for short, the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. He's also the immediate past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the founding partner of ICAN, and itself the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He has published in various journals on the medical consequences of nuclear war. Our third speaker is Melissa Parke, who is the current executive director of ICAN. She's a former United Nations legal expert, an Australian government minister with over 2 decades of experience in the fields of international development, human rights, law, and politics, and has also served as an ICAN Australia ambassador, in which capacity she has championed the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, since 2017. She has a strong interest in history, social justice, health development, as well as passion for animals, environment, biodiversity, in short, planetary health and well-being. Our fourth and last speaker is Nicole Ponce, an environmental activist and human rights lawyer advocate from the Philippines, who is also our youth representative on the panel. Her work and interests mainly involve the application of international law on different themes such as climate change, environment, human rights, peace, and security, and her current efforts are primarily directed towards obtaining an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice regarding human rights in the face of the climate crisis. She's actively involved in this initiative under the shared name, the World's Youth for Climate Justice, as one of its founders, and serves on the Global Steering Committee as the Asian Front Convener. Welcome again, speakers. Tristan has kindly shared the details, full bios of the speakers. Please do take a look. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to our first speaker, Michael, to get us going. Michael, please.
Oh, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone who's listening in. I'm just thrilled to be on such a broad panel and especially to be joined by young people, given the importance of young people in addressing these issues. So I have a small slideshow to present to you, and I will begin with that right away. So my job is to link the issues for you, climate change and nuclear war, and how they are interacting and reinforcing each other. So please show the next slide. So my first point, all right, there's too many words, but I'll summarize this for you, and you could take a quick look at the words and we could talk about it later. But my first point is that both the climate, wait, go back a bit. Thank you. My first point is that both the climate crisis and the nuclear arms race are accelerating, not decelerating at this time. I think you all know that. I don't have to elaborate on that, but I just want to make the point that global carbon emissions are rising, and as a result, temperatures are rising, and as a consequence, global social conditions are likely to deteriorate. At the same time, all of the nuclear powers are increasing their nuclear arsenals, and tensions between the major powers are on the increase. So next slide, please. This is just to show data demonstrating that oil consumption continues to rise around the world, and according to the International Energy Agency, is expected to continue increasing throughout this decade into the 2030s. Coal is likely to peak in the 2030s before declining, and natural gas is expected to continue in consumption well into the 2040s. As a consequence, the assumptions are that global carbon emissions will continue to increase into the 2030s. What this means is that the requirement that these emissions drop by 45% to keep global warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level cannot be met. Next slide, please. So I want to make 3 points quickly on the basis of this. The most important point I want you to take away from what I say is that anything that distracts us from achieving the worldwide goal of reducing carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 actually contributes to the likelihood of global warming going beyond 1.5 degrees. So you just can't say that we go on as business as usual and it won't have an impact. Anything that doesn't contribute is a distraction from our primary goal. And once we exceed 1.5 degrees, scientists tell us that societies will begin experiencing catastrophic effects. And at that point, nuclear issues and climate issues will interact and reinforce one another. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of these interactions. I will speak about each briefly, and I know you're going to have questions about it that I'll have to answer later, but briefly, these are the ways in which nuclear activities contribute to growing climate dangers, and climate developments contribute to growing nuclear dangers. As I said, anything that diverts from the goal of reducing carbon emissions actually contributes to the dangers we face. So the diversion of funds from climate action to military activities actually is a contribution to the perils we face. Secondly, US-China arms racing prevents joint mutual cooperation to create a global leadership movement around the world to reduce global warming. And third, nuclear weapons constitute the apex of a military system that is powered by oil. And as long as that's the case, political elites are not going to address climate change. I'll elaborate on all of these briefly in a minute. So why don't we go immediately to the next slide, because so I don't repeat myself. The diversion of funds. So just a few weeks ago, President Biden signed the National Defense Authorization Act for 2024, $886 billion. That's more than the GNP of most nations around the world for military procurement and operations in 2024, including nuclear weapons. So long as, and by the way, this is the only bill that Democrats and Republicans are able to agree on. And as long as military preparations and nuclear arms production remain the top national priorities, governing elites will not take the necessary actions to slow global warming. Next slide. Next slide, please. Secondly, there's one missing, just the one before. That's right. I want to emphasize my belief that to really develop global cooperation, global action to halt warming, there must be leadership by the US and China, the two leading emitters of carbon dioxide. When you had that cooperation in 2015, when President Obama and Xi Jinping worked jointly to ensure the passage of the 2015 Paris Agreement, then you can have progress. When those two powers are in conflict with one another, you cannot have international progress on climate change. And to my mind, this is the biggest obstacle to international action. Now the next slide, please. This is perhaps a more nuanced point, but for those of us who live in a highly militarized society like the United States, and I'm sure it's so true in China and certainly in Russia, nuclear weapons are the apex of an oil-powered military-industrial complex. And the military in these countries are the leading institutional consumers of petroleum, and their petroleum use is increasing. And as long as you have a military industrial complex powered by petroleum with nuclear weapons at the apex of that system, the political elites in these countries will never take the steps to eliminate carbon reliance and to stop their emissions of carbon dioxide. So the military-industrial machine, oil-powered machine, oil and the military are interdependent, and that's something that we have to challenge. Next slide, please. Now, the other way around, how climate contributes to growing nuclear dangers. Again, I have 3 points very quickly. Climate-related social breakdown in nuclear armed states could lead to the uncontrolled use of nuclear weapons. There are countries that are nuclear armed, like China, India, and Pakistan, that are very vulnerable to climate change impacts, especially a severe water scarcity. And internally, this could lead to the breakdown of society as large parts of society lose their ability to produce food. And you have the breakdown of social institutions and the outbreak of sectarian and separatist movements that gain control of nuclear weapons and possibly use them in internal conflicts. The same thing could happen between these countries, especially when they share a common source of water, like the Indus River or the Brahmaputra River. These rivers depend on glaciers in the Himalaya Mountains, and these glaciers are melting because of climate change. And so the future of these rivers is in doubt. These are major sources of water that are in contestation. And you could see conflicts between these countries over water that could lead to nuclear conflict. One more slide. And finally, we could talk about the melting of the Arctic ice cap as a result of climate change, opening up a new region rich in resources that's contested among the major powers, the United States and Russia, and now China claims access to the Arctic region. So you could have future conflict over the resources of the Arctic and access to the Arctic that could spark a nuclear war, especially given that Russia stations most of its nuclear submarines in the Arctic region. So key takeaways, my last slide, please. So efforts to slow global warming and prevent extreme climate effects have to address the militaristic impulses that now govern elite policy making among the major powers, especially the US and China. That has to be as part of our work on climate change. And as I've argued, global efforts to reduce carbon emissions will not succeed without US-China leadership together. So promoting U.S.-China climate cooperation has to be a top priority for all our work, and that could be a path to peace. And finally, peaceful development of the Arctic should be a priority, as well as water cooperation in the Himalayan water basins. So I think that's a lot to give you, and hopefully we could come back to some of these points later. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for setting the scene and showcasing the relationship between nuclear and climate dangers and how they contribute to each other. Next up, I'll hand over the floor to Ira. Take us further. Ira, you're on mute.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And thank you, Michael, for that presentation. I think it's quite clear from this that the climate crisis is increasing the danger of nuclear war. And since the climate crisis is going to progress, as Michael pointed out, over the next decade, no matter what we do right now, we have to understand that the danger of nuclear war is going to grow increasingly during this period of time as well. And so it's really incumbent upon us, and particularly to people who understand the threat posed by climate crisis, to also appreciate the danger posed by nuclear weapons and to begin to take action to get rid of these weapons as quickly as possible, to get them off the table so they're not available as the conflicts that the climate crisis creates will progress. I want to talk to you. My job today is to describe what happens if the climate crisis does produce a nuclear war. And I address these remarks particularly to young people in the audience because it is our experience that many young people have simply not been introduced to information about the dangers of nuclear war and what will happen. There are two broad categories: the direct effects of nuclear conflict, what happens in the countries that fight the nuclear war, and the broader impact on the entire planet, which is largely mediated by climate disruption. Let me start by talking a little bit about the direct effects. Many of us have images in our mind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is important for us to understand that while these are important warnings about what nuclear weapons can do, they do not begin to prepare us for what will actually happen if there is a nuclear war today. Because if any of the major nuclear powers engage in war with other powers in the nuclear realm, it's not going to be one or two small nuclear weapons on one or two cities. It's going to be many weapons on many cities. And most of these weapons will be anywhere from 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I want to describe an attack on a single city to give an appreciation of what that would look like. And I'm going to use the model of a single very large nuclear explosion. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either, say, the United States or Russia, but we do believe that a major city like Moscow, like New York, like Tokyo, if it were involved in the conflict, would be targeted with many nuclear warheads, each of which, again, would be in the range of 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb which destroyed Hiroshima. So I'm going to use a model of a single large explosion to describe the extent of the destruction that would take place under that kind of an attack. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 3 kilometers. Within this area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles, 6 kilometers in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour, 1,000 kilometers per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 16 miles, 25 kilometers in every direction, the heat would be so intense that everything flammable would burn. A giant firestorm would develop over the next half hour as hundreds of thousands of fires ignite and then coalesce. And within this entire area, 32 miles, 50 kilometers across, the temperatures would rise to 800 degrees centigrade. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York City, we're talking about 15 million people dead in a half an hour. In the case of Tokyo, the death toll would be even greater. And This kind of destruction would take place in every major city in the countries involved in this conflict. All told, in the course of a single afternoon, several 100 million people would die. And the entire economic infrastructure of all of the countries involved would be destroyed. Those who survived the initial blast and fire would find themselves in a situation where there was no internet, no electric grid, no phone service, no public health service, no food distribution network. And in the months following that attack, most of the people who survived the initial bombing would also die from starvation, from epidemic disease, from radiation poisoning. But these are just the direct effects of the nuclear weapons on the countries which are targeted. Globally, the situation would be even more catastrophic. A large-scale war between the United States and Russia would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 10 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures would drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the last ice age. And under these conditions, food production across the planet would stop. And a study published in August of 2022 showed that more than 5 million, perhaps as many as more than 5 billion, perhaps as many as 6 billion people would starve to death in the first 2 years of the famine that resulted from this nuclear war. And the famine would continue beyond the first 2 years. The same study showed that even a much smaller nuclear war, one that might take place between India and Pakistan, that involved just 100 warheads, each of 250, involved 250 warheads, each of 100 kilotons strength. That conflict would put 37 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, drop temperatures across the planet 5.5 degrees centigrade, and produce a famine that killed over 2 billion people worldwide, a quarter of humanity, in the first 2 years. And the famine would continue beyond that. The study only looked at the first 2 years. Neither of these scenarios would necessarily mean the extinction of our species. They would mean the end of civilization as we know it. And we need to understand that what I have just described is not the plot of some movie. It is the danger we are facing every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist, and it is what is going to happen if we continue on the path we are currently on. This is a very grim picture, but the most important thing for us to remember is that this does not need to happen. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. We have built them with our own hands. We know how to take them apart. And what is missing is the political will to do that. And so I will turn the podium over to Melissa and Nicole so they can talk to us about what we need to do to create that political will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira, for sharing about the stark, direct effects of nuclear war and the broader impact on the planet. Turning over to Melissa.
Hello, everybody. How are we all today? So I just want to say a little bit about ICAN. ICAN was started originally in Melbourne in Australia in 2007 by a small group of people sitting around a kitchen table and asking themselves what could they do to rid the world of the most devastating weapons ever devised. Just 10 years later, ICAN had become a civil society movement made up of hundreds of partner organisations around the world and won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for helping to get a new UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted at the United Nations. That treaty, also known as the TPNW, came into force in 2021, so it's 3 years old. And this treaty is a game changer. It's rooted in the moral, legal, humanitarian and environmental imperative to ban these weapons of mass destruction. In Australia, my home country, we've just commemorated the 70th anniversary of British nuclear weapons testing. which disproportionately affected Australian Aboriginal people, who were the primary victims along with veterans. And many of the survivors and their children continue to suffer debilitating health issues and are still waiting for compensation and environmental remediation of their lands. And this is the same situation for peoples in the Pacific, North Africa, in Kazakhstan, and North America, who were subjected to nuclear weapons testing by colonial powers, and that has destroyed their health and their environment. The new treaty provides for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And so it's about ensuring justice for those who've already been affected by nuclear weapons, but also trying to ensure that it never happens again to anyone else. It is deeply ironic, I think, in a way, that most of the victims of nuclear weapons testing have been Indigenous peoples, and they're the ones who've always understood the connection between all things, between people, animals, and nature, and that there is a natural balance that must be respected. And that the world is seriously unbalanced is evidenced by the multiple challenges now facing the world. The three existential crises of nuclear weapons, climate change, and biodiversity loss, also known as species extinction. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists last year moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been to global catastrophe, based on the existential threats of nuclear weapons and the environment crisis. And it was really significant that they linked these threats. You could say that nuclear weapons are climate change and mass species extinction at supersonic speed, or that while climate change and biodiversity loss are eroding our chances every day, nuclear weapons can end them in an instant. Nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction, as Ira explained so eloquently. They are designed to kill millions of people and destroy and contaminate their homes, cities, lands, waters, and climate for eons. They're not an abstract, distant threat, but instead present an existential danger to all life on Earth for as long as they exist. Now, nuclear-armed states say that nuclear weapons are only there for deterrence, but for as long as they exist, there is the chance they will be used, whether by accident or design, by an unhinged leader, a terrorist group, a cyber attack, or by a simple mistake. And the large number of nuclear weapons on high alert launch status makes this all the more likely, as does the increased use of artificial intelligence by the military, which is accelerating the speed of war making and decreasing the time for nuclear decision making. We also know that there have been many nuclear accidents and near misses over the decades that could have ended in disaster. And the reason that we're still here to talk about it is more good luck than good management. It's really important, I believe, that we break down the silos where nuclear weapons are only discussed in disarmament and security fora by so-called defence and security experts. Nuclear weapons are everyone's business. Nuclear weapons are not separate from other global concerns, as Michael so clearly showed. They're deeply interconnected. Nuclear weapons worsen environmental problems. They destroy health. They divert essential funds away from addressing pressing global challenges like climate change and social inequality, and they undermine the principles of human rights and justice. Can you imagine a bigger threat, a bigger violation of human rights than nuclear weapons? The right to life, the right to health, the right to clean environment, boom, gone. The SDGs, all gone. Nuclear war is bad for everyone's health. In August last year, more than 150 medical journals from around the world, including The Lancet, issued a joint call for urgent action to eliminate nuclear weapons as a public health priority. Ira's already mentioned the study in Nature, which concluded that even a limited nuclear war would kill 120 million people outright and cause global climate disruption, leading to a nuclear famine, putting at least 2 billion people at risk. A major nuclear war would kill upwards of 5.5 billion in a nuclear winter, as well as most other life forms. So nuclear weapons are not only bad for people, and they're bad for the environment, not just climate, but all of nature. We know that biodiversity is already under extreme threat, with 70% decline in animal species in the last 50 years, according to WWF. Some scientists say the 6th mass extinction of species is underway, the first caused by humans. A nuclear winter would cause the 6th mass extinction to come even sooner. And in addition to nuclear winter, there are further connections between nuclear weapons and climate change and biodiversity loss. And Michael has mentioned some of them. You know that nuclear weapons production and testing damage the environment and increase emissions, exacerbating the climate crisis. The increase in extreme weather events and rising sea levels accelerates the risks of radioactive contamination from nuclear weapons activities. As Michael mentioned, nuclear war will become more likely due to a climate crisis-driven rise of resource scarcity and conflict. And nuclear war would have a devastating impact upon the environment and all living things. There was some significant research concluded last year in Japan that found that the priority for animal species conservation must be 1, to prevent nuclear war, 2, decrease deforestation rates, 3, reduce pollution, and 4, limit global warming, in that order. And that research highlights the fact that while every species will be harmed in a nuclear war, only one species can stop it. Thus, the abolition of nuclear weapons is an essential part of respecting and protecting the planet, the climate, humanity, and all living things. There can be no nuclear weapons on a sustainable planet. In a joint statement in 2022, UN Security Council members agreed that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. The only way to ensure this is total disarmament. And with heightened tension and conflicts around the world, breakdown in nuclear arms control agreements, the renewal of nuclear threats, it's never been more urgent or important for the international community to take action to eliminate nuclear weapons. And luckily, the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons does provide a pathway to their elimination. Climate campaigners have taken inspiration from ICAN's global campaign on the treaty to start a global campaign for a new treaty on fossil fuels. It's essential that the 3 existential threats are tackled simultaneously, while noting that the urgent elimination of nuclear weapons would, in addition to preventing nuclear Armageddon, have the effect of assisting with the other global crises. Tim Wallace, US activist, points out in his new book, Warheads to Windmills, we can't do much about the climate while the biggest carbon emitting countries are pointing nuclear warheads at each other. So eliminating nuclear weapons would bring about the increased global cooperation that is needed to deal with the other global challenges. It would significantly reduce carbon emissions and other environmental damage from nuclear weapons development and testing. It would free up thousands of STEM graduates, scientists and researchers currently working in the nuclear industries, and release billions of dollars. US $83 billion was spent last year on nuclear arsenals to deal with climate change and the biodiversity crises, among other things. The biggest carbon emitters are also the major nuclear powers. And both on climate and nuclear weapons, there are powerful industries spending vast amounts of money on lobbying and political donations, leading to vested interests and government capture. So, but we've got something even more powerful on our side, and that's people power. So let's recognise the incredible power of civil society in changing history. As anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And, you know, ICAN is a great example of what collective global action can achieve. So what we need to do is to make the peace and environment movements even stronger by combining our efforts and thinking about the issues holistically. What is our vision for the planet? What does a sustainable planet look like? It certainly doesn't have nuclear weapons on it, and it requires strong and urgent action on climate and biodiversity. We need to take every opportunity to broaden our messages and our audiences, and also to cultivate more messengers to take the message into the community: scientists, trade unions, consumers, artists, local governments, financial institutions, health and education institutions. We especially need more young people to get involved and active. I mean, we've got, I know we've got the Youth for TPNW, and I noticed that Molly McGinty is here on this event today, which is wonderful to see. And we've got the young professionals in foreign policy in Tokyo. And of course, we've got Nicole's group. And so I'll take this moment now to hand over to Nicole.
Thank you, Melissa, for highlighting that there's not just one, there's not just two, but three existential threats that we need to be concerned about, and other activities. And thank you for also ending on that slightly more positive note, that there is something we can do and there is a role for all the different stakeholders to play. Turning then on to our youth representative, Nicole.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. It's really a great pleasure to be on the same panel with these esteemed individuals. It's a great pleasure to join you all today. So yeah, the question I'm tasked to address for this session is the role of youth and what the youth can do, and why is it important from a justice perspective. So I'm happy to present the work that we do under World Youth for Climate Justice. We are a global youth-led campaign to take climate change and human rights to the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, to seek an advisory opinion. So our aim is to clarify obligations of states to protect the rights of current and future generations from the adverse effects of climate change. Now, in our campaign for an advisory opinion on climate change and human rights, we recognize the linkages between climate change and several pressing problems of our time, one being the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and of course, nuclear war. In fact, both are considered as principal threats and threaten life on a planetary scale. So climate change is increasingly being called a security problem, and according to the UN, a threat multiplier, as what our panelists have eloquently showed and shared with us. So the loss of land and livelihoods against a backdrop of persistent poverty, displacement, and other insecurities can trigger competition for scarce resources and fuel social tensions. So this increases the risk of war and the use of nuclear weapons. The inequality and vulnerability brought about, as well as exacerbated by climate change, across various socio-demographics all over the world, increasingly undermine human security in the present day and will increasingly do so in the future by reducing access to and the quality of natural resources that are important to sustain livelihoods. So climate change is also likely to undermine the capacity of states to provide the opportunities and services that help people to sustain their livelihoods. And people and communities are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change and the existence of nuclear weapons. It exacerbates pre-existing inequalities and human rights challenges such as poverty, well-being, inequality, gender relations, and many others, and affects vulnerable groups most acutely. But despite an increased understanding of the climate and nuclear threat and a growing urgency for action in both fronts, little attention has been given on how they may interact with each other. So this nexus between climate change and the threat of nuclear war is urgent and crucial. Both threaten life on a planetary scale, so both require a global response. In fact, the impacts are so overarching that the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, has referred to the need to protect generations unborn. Thus, it comes as no surprise that there is growing interest among youth to clarify states' obligations under international law to protect the rights of present and future generations from the adverse effects of climate change. Because many of us, especially from where I come from my humble archipelago from the Philippines, this threat is existential, which is at stake is full enjoyment of our basic human rights. So for us in the World's Youth for Climate Justice, we recognize the ICJ being the right international forum to hear evidence of law and fact that will help deliver a verdict that could assist in paving a way for the development of law that can help, among many other things, remove room for real doubt on climate science and form public consciousness on climate change, and a catalyst for more ambitious climate actions. So to reiterate what the court said in its advisory opinion on the legality of the threat of use of nuclear weapons, the environment is not an abstraction, but represents living space, the quality of life, and the very health of human beings, including generations unborn. So one of the most important actions that young people could do to help address the climate nuclear nexus is to amplify their voices through meaningful participation in domestic and international policy and legislative processes that seek to address pressing environmental and human rights issues. Now, what does this look like? First, call on your government and international organizations. Hold them accountable and demand accountability from your leaders. Take part in policy processes and strengthen and build upon the youth government alliances. Second is we strongly encourage youth to strategize with other civil society organizations on how to include stories of empirical evidence in their advocacies or in dealings with their governments and their leaders, an annex of lived realities and experiences from our communities. I believe that this is one of the best ways that we can convince and persuade our leaders to hear our cause. And the third is meet with your government representatives and lobby your government to include strong points on climate justice, peace and security, law, not war, and intergenerational equity. Because as we are in a critical stage to prevent climate change from exceeding global tipping points, there must be no room for ambiguity on state obligations, on how our parents patriae should uphold human rights. Marginalized communities who are suffering disproportionately from the impacts of climate change and the existence of nuclear weapons must be ensured that their human rights are not discounted. And later on, I would be happy to give a brief and concise summary of what other roles the youth can do to have or to be able to participate in a meaningful manner in terms of addressing existential threats of our time. So thank you for your time and your attention, and I'll give it back to Tristan and Erica.
Thank you, Nicole, for highlighting what the youth can do already and already kickstarting our Q&A session. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. We're now open for questions and answers. Just a reminder, please do type in your questions in the chat so that we can ask our panelists. I already have a few questions that are coming in. So the first question is whether the panel feels, in light of the possible escalation of the nuclear-armed Israel's war in Gaza, whether it could increase the danger of nuclear war, and as a result, if the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists will therefore move the hands of the doomsday clock even closer to midnight on January. I think Melissa may have been the one who brought that up. Perhaps, Melissa, you can take this question.
It wasn't me who brought it up, but I'm happy to make a comment, and I'm sure others may wish to say something as well. Of course, any conflict that involves where there's involving a nuclear armed state means that the dangers are significantly enhanced. So we've now got two two major conflicts going on in the world involving nuclear armed states. We have Ukraine and Russia, and we have Israel. And so in Palestine. So it's yeah, a very dangerous situation. And what was the question in relation to that Gaza issue?
Just as the increase of potential danger of nuclear war, whether the bulletin will move the clock even further.
Oh, yes, the doomsday clock. Yes, well, we're waiting with bated breath to find out what they come up with this year. I guess it's going to be out in the next week or so. So we'll be watching that. But I can't imagine, with everything that's going on in the world now, that that it either won't stay, it probably will stay the same or get even closer to midnight. That would be my prediction, unfortunately.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm just looking if anyone else on the panel has an opinion on this.
Let me just say that I would add a third nuclear risk that has increased as of yesterday, which is the elections in Taiwan. This is not to disparage the choice of the Taiwanese people. They voted in the democratic election. They chose a candidate from the DPP who's likely to continue the move towards Taiwanese independence, but China is likely to respond with more pressure on Taiwan in the form of sending planes and ships into the vicinity of that area, and that's going to put pressure on President Biden to respond in a similar manner. So I think Taiwan is going to become a more tense area in the months ahead, and we're going to have to work very hard to try to prevent that from happening.
And I would also add, while much of the world's attention has shifted towards the conflict between Israel and Hamas, the war in Ukraine continues, and there's been an incredible uptick just in the last couple of weeks in the level of Russian threat to use nuclear weapons in that conflict. And we can't lose sight of the extraordinary danger that conflict poses to the world. The bottom line in all this, I think, it goes to the points that Nicole and Melissa were making, that we have got to move as quickly as we possibly can to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether, so they're simply not on the table and not available to be used in any of these conflicts.
Thank you, Ira, because that actually very nicely ties into the second question that's been posed by an audience member who's very supportive of nuclear risk activism and aware of the huge danger that nuclear weapons pose to the entire planet. He's asking if should nuclear risk and climate activism review the way, methods, and strategies they're currently using to hopefully act in a more realistic and effective way. Perhaps I can rephrase that. So how best can nuclear risk and climate activists approach this issue in light of the dangers that you've all highlighted and the roles that they've played? How best is there a way that they can further improve the way they go about addressing their respective threats in their silos to work together?
I would comment that I think it's important that we not be in silos anymore on these two issues. They're clearly deeply interconnected. And I would say further that I think within the community working on nuclear weapons issues, there is a fairly significant appreciation of the enormity of the threat posed by the climate crisis. At the moment, that is not the case within the climate community. There is a huge climate community, active community of climate activists, which is a wonderful thing. But many of those people are young people who have never been brought the information about the danger of nuclear war. And much of our responsibility, I think, is to help young climate activists understand that, in fact, there is another existential threat, the very grave and immediate danger of nuclear war that also must be addressed, both because it in and of itself poses an existential threat, and because, as Michael pointed out, the nuclear enterprise is making it harder to deal with the climate crisis. So I think there's a tremendous possibility for synergistic activity between these two groups of activists working to confront these two twin existential threats.
Thank you, Ira. I'm just looking to the panel if anyone else would like to add as to how best these two groups can work together and interface to address our existential threats. Yes, Michael.
Well, I'm repeating a point that I made in my presentation, which is that I think that the U.S. and China are at the epicenter of the climate threat and the nuclear threat. It's true, as Ira said, that there's a rising nuclear threat from Russia around Ukraine, but looking long term, the greatest risk in my mind is a nuclear war arising between US and China over Taiwan. And that's because that's where US and Chinese interests collide in a very realistic way in the current environment. And these are two powers that are increasingly at loggerheads. But these are also the leading emitters of carbon dioxide and the leading investors in renewable energy. So you could turn this on its head and argue that the US and China should collaborate in renewable energy and in global climate leadership that would both advance the climate agenda more than any other possible collaboration, and also forge a path towards nuclear peace. And it's urgent because China is now rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. So I hope that people will see that possible synergy.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just looking at Melissa and Nicole. Is there anything you would like to add? Okay. Sorry, Nicole, were you just unmuted? Yeah.
Yes, I guess I would just really like to say that events like this is a great start, inviting people, I mean, such as myself, young persons such as myself, to take part in these kinds of conversations. I'm not an expert on nuclear disarmament. I've had some experience, but it can be intimidating, but just starting conversations like this really help raise awareness. So yeah, thank you guys.
Yes,
I will say something. I think in terms of breaking out of the silos, I think we find that UN agencies, governments and most NGOs are still operating very much in silos. If you look at the UN, the only UN office that really talks about nuclear weapons is the Office of Disarmament Affairs, but never the Office of Human Rights, UN Environment Programme, World Health Organization, or UN Development Programme. And yet, you know, they have deep interests in this issue. Those issues are deeply connected: development, health, human rights, the environment. So we need to ensure that there's no conference or on climate or biodiversity that occurs without discussion of nuclear weapons, and vice versa, that the climate and biodiversity implications of nuclear war are raised at every meeting about nuclear weapons. And the same goes for other issues around human rights, development and health. So this is about broadening our message and having more messengers and more different audiences. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. I think that's a very valid point, because one thing that we do notice is there's so many events that are taking place. So you've got the COP on the climate change side, for example, and you've got the nuclear NPT conferences that are taking place. But do you see cross-fertilization happening? Do climate activists attend these NPT conferences? Do nuclear disarmament activists attend the COP, for example?
Well, there was at the meeting of states parties to the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in late November, December, just last year in New York, there was a side event that called into the COP, which was happening at the same time in Dubai. And so that's the sort of thing that really, I mean, we would have actually been at COP if they weren't happening at the same time. So it was a bit unfortunate that happened, that overlap. But I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do more of. And that's we'll certainly be looking to do that at ICAN.
Thank you, Marissa. I think I have a specific question for Ira. We now know that no amount of preparation can ever prepare us to respond to a nuclear war. Based on the model you've described, just how overwhelmed would health facilities be, perhaps in neighboring cities, following the use of nuclear weapons?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. And I think the answer is completely overwhelmed. It has been the finding of the Red Cross since the 1940s, the message of IPPNW since its founding, that even a single nuclear bomb would totally overwhelm the medical resources of the city that was targeted. And it's our experience in past disasters that it takes a great deal of time for support to come in from the outside world in the event of even a natural disaster like an earthquake, let alone a nuclear attack with all the uncertainties, the radiation contamination and so on that would be involved in that kind of a scenario. That's a single nuclear weapon. In the event of a large-scale use of nuclear weapons, there is no outside world. Everybody's affected. And it is very, very important to understand that there is no medical response possible once the bombs fall, which is why it is so critically important to prevent their ever being used. And as we now understand, really the only way we can prevent their being used with certainty is to get rid of them. As long as they exist, we are living with this threat hanging over our head. And despite the assurances from our leaders that this is a stable situation, that nuclear weapons will deter their own use and we can maintain nuclear arsenals forever and nothing bad will happen, I think we need to buy into the much more realistic assessment of people like former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who says, quite importantly, we're not here because we know what we're doing. We're here because, and I'm quoting him now, we lucked out. It was luck that has prevented nuclear war. Our luck isn't going to last. If we don't get rid of these weapons, they're going to be used, and there will be no response possible.
Thank you, Ira. I think the next question is directed at Michael, actually. I think as part of your presentation, that you make this very stark statement that's actually very thought-provoking, which is anything that's not contribution is a distraction. And I think that's a very key point that you made. I think the question that arises is, how do you balance the varying conflicting interests? Because if you're focused on climate, then you're going to just ignore security. If you're focused on security, climate may not be such a big priority. How do you balance these varying interests? And I suppose this also relates to the question of silos. As you de-silo it, and as more things interact, how do you prioritize these different interests? And particularly coming from different perspectives of states which are heavy on the nuclear side, so like US, China, as you mentioned. How do you actually prioritize?
Thank you. And I've also gotten a comment in the chat about this, and I think I might have phrased that poorly. What I was really getting at was the priorities of government spending, that so long as the top priority of government spending and government action and the thinking of government officials is towards military issues and nuclear issues, then there will not be the resources and the attention devoted to the climate crisis. And you know, you have to think in terms of bandwidth. Right now, President Biden and President Putin, and to maybe a lesser degree, President Xi, are so overwhelmingly focused on security threats as they see them, which are military security threats. And they may talk about climate change, but it's not on their radar. And that's what has to change. And the way I suggest doing that, and my book, my last book, All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change, is to argue, and very much drawing on what Ira Helfand has been saying, and others, is that climate change poses a security threat to the nations that will in time exceed any other conceivable security threat. So you can find senior military officials in many of these countries saying that, in fact, climate change is a national security threat, an existential threat. Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, labeled climate change as a national security threat. And I tried to argue to those who might discount the environmental argument about climate change, that in fact, if you approach this from a national security perspective, that climate change is going to devastate the United States. It's going to devastate China and Japan for sure. All these countries are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and it's going to make any other conceivable military threat irrelevant as time goes on. So that's how I try to address those who are fixated, obsessed with, traditional security threats.
Thank you, Michael, for clarifying that. And I think you.
I may have to leave in a few minutes, so if I don't have another chance to express my appreciation for the sponsors of this and my fellow panelists, who I all admire and thank for their excellent work, for all the good things they do.
Thank you, Michael. I think just one final question before we wrap up Q&A, and being on climate justice. And I think this is something very much in Nicole's context. Climate justice, is, especially as you mentioned with the advisory opinions that are going on, is on everyone's mind and is a critical component of peace as well. So in what ways would you say are nuclear justice and climate justice related?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd like to think about it this way. What do we want to achieve at the end of the day? In the climate human rights nexus, we really want to make sure that the present and future generations, we have a healthy environment, a safe home for everyone. We want to uphold human rights because we already know at this point that the climate change is a threat multiplier and it affects various facets of human rights, such as access to clean air, access to clean water, access to health. So the way I think about it is that we must address not only from the climate perspective, but existential threats that exist. So, and that includes the threat of nuclear weapons and, of course, nuclear war. So by doing that, then we are able to, at the end of the day, work towards a future that we want, or what we want to achieve, which is at the end of the day, uphold human rights, make sure that we have a healthy place to live in, and and make sure that marginalized communities and marginalized people and vulnerable communities are not as acutely affected by these existential threats. So that's how I frame it.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I think it's time to wrap up our Q&A. I just want to give one final opportunity, particularly to Ira and Melissa, because I know Nicole will address this later in her closing remarks. What is the one thing you would like to tell our youth participants of this webinar? One advice you'd like to give them as to how they can face this threat, this existential threat that you've highlighted and spoken about today? How best can they act?
Well, the comment I would like to close with is just, I'm fully aware of the fact that the presentation I give can be very depressing. The news is very grim, and there's no way around that. We have to be honest with ourselves. But the rest of that story is that there is great hope, I think, for the future. We came very close to nuclear war in the 1980s on a number of occasions. The situation then was almost as desperate as it is today. I think it's a bit worse now, but it was almost this bad then. And millions of people took action on the nuclear weapons issue, and we were able to end the Cold War arms race. And I think that movement literally save the world. I think we would have had a nuclear war back in the 1980s if it were not for the activism of people then. So we know we can do this because we've already done it once. We can build a movement that deals with the climate crisis and deals with the nuclear crisis. And, you know, I think we should face these very daunting threats with a real sense of confidence that we have the ability to deal with them. And we just have to put our minds to it. And I am personally, despite the horrible things I talk about all the time, I'm very optimistic that we're going to succeed. And I think that we're all going to be able to look ourselves in the mirror someday and say, hey, we helped save the world. And that's going to be pretty great.
Thank you, Ira. Melissa?
Wow, thank you, Ira, for those beautiful words. I don't know what I can add to that. I mean, I think it is important for people to understand the reality of nuclear weapons and what they do. And so it's really important to educate yourself, read, and then do the right thing. Horror, humor, and hope. So yes, there is horror with nuclear weapons. And I think the way to deal with the horror is to inject some humor. And, you know, that's a really good way of communicating a difficult message in a way that people can take it in and not reject it and not turn away from it. And also in providing some hope, and working together with others is the best way of retaining hope and optimism. And that's why I think ICAN is such a powerful civil society movement. And if we could just somehow fuse the peace and the environmental movements, imagine what light we could shine on the world. So yeah, let's just get out there and educate ourselves and others and take action, and don't forget to have a bit of fun and humor on the way.
Thank you very much. On that very hopeful note, thank you all to all our speakers for their engaging remarks and also the engaging questions from our audience. I know that we were not able to address all of the questions that were posed, but I will pass them on to the speakers and to the organizers in hopes that perhaps they can be answered in another format. So thank you very much. So next up, as we consider the role of youth in the climate nuclear nexus, it is important to highlight the unfolding stories of underrepresented youth living at the nexus of the climate crisis, militarization, and conflict. As Tristan mentioned earlier, Kasha Sequoia Slavner is doing just that. She is a Gen Z award-winning documentary filmmaker and founder of the global Sunrise Movement. Her documentary, 1.5 Degrees of Peace, tells the stories of youth active in the peace and environmental and climate justice space, and their brave push for a more peaceful and just future. Kasha has been kind enough to allow us to feature part of a documentary to hone in on this message of inclusivity, community, and stewardship for our planet. Just give me a second.
Peace and climate justice are more connected than we realize. I'm Kasha Sequoia Slavner. I'm a Gen Z documentary filmmaker and a peace and climate activist from Toronto, Canada. I've been feeling so much anxiety about climate change. Uncertain, frustrated. People are making decisions for our generation without taking our future realities into consideration.
A code red for humanity released today by the United Nations paints a grim picture for our future unless we take action now.
I'm on a mission to show just how closely connected peace and climate justice are.
Wars, a lot of militarization are taking away budgets, but are also putting a lot of carbon emissions in the air.
Through stories of youth making positive change.
Those who are already exposed to violence and war are those who are also most vulnerable to the extreme weather events.
movements of all kinds are pretty much single issue. They're siloed. Climate change and nuclear weapons, we have to deal with them together.
And stop both clocks ticking towards our extinction. How can we turn our anxiety about these existential threats into bold action that holds leaders accountable? How can we find hope?
The climate crisis isn't just about carbon dioxide emissions, it's about people.
What if people were as well trained in waging peace as soldiers are in waging war?
We need a peace movement to accommodate everyone because everyone's life is at stake.
A community led by the most marginalized sectors of society, fueled by this love for peace and love for the planet.
Take small steps, baby steps. The ripple effect will be very dramatic. Each one of us is powerful beyond measure.
It's my hope that these stories of courageous action ease our personal and collective anxiety, igniting us to stand together and catalyzing a unified intergenerational peace movement for the survival of our planet and all living beings. Unless we do something, we're in deep shit.
Thank you so much. Thank you, YPFP, to actually speaking to Kasha and helping her to share this documentary. Kasha's documentary is finishing production and will be available in the near future. I think right now I'll hand over to Nicole Ponce for her closing remarks. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, I'm from the Philippines, and at the height of the global pandemic, my country suffered like so many. And as we were battling deaths on a daily basis, we were also battling hunger because of food insecurity. So climate change-induced extreme weather, such as floods and storms, ravage our lands, destroying crops and affecting agriculture in its wake. So if climate change undermines human security, why don't we move the money used for nuclear weapons to fighting climate change? So as young people, engage young change makers as yourselves. Coming from a youth perspective, we have identified 6 pillars that are essential for our campaign, and I believe it will prove helpful as well in different stakeholder collaborations. So first is the courtroom. We've seen this the rise of cases in the recent years. So we encourage young people to make their governments accountable. As I mentioned earlier, states as states, parents patria, have the duty to protect their people, the present and future generations, and uphold their basic rights. Second is national campaigns. Start national campaigns and uplifting youth. Third is engage with civil society coalitions. And fourth is research writing and legal advocacy, which is a crucial part in our advocacy. So be informed, as what Melissa mentioned earlier, get educated, back your claims with the latest scientific evidence and reports. Fifth is international advocacy. So address issues such as climate change and nuclear weapons and nuclear war. It requires a global effort. And lastly, this one's my favorite, is telling stories of impact. So become storytellers, like Kasha did earlier and showed in her documentary. Communicate your lived realities and how the effects of climate change and the threats of nuclear war have affected your communities and your homes. So in World's Youth for Climate Justice, we actually call ourselves stubborn optimists, because we refuse to accept the world as it is. And as long as there are platforms such as this that allows voices like mine to be heard, we will continue to speak and act. Because at this point, we are racing against time. And in the words of Jonathan Schell, It would be a shame to save the Earth from warming only to burn it up in an instant in a nuclear war. So I hope you share our stubborn optimism as well, and thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our distinguished guests and speakers for your fascinating remarks today. Thank you to all of our guests for joining our webinar titled Navigating the Climate Nuclear Nexus, Our Climate Crisis and Nuclear War. We are also thankful to all of our supporters and our partners and co-sponsors for today's event that helped to promote this to a wide audience. Through our dialogue today, we are reminded that there is more to learn, more voices to include, and more to develop and grow in the future on this topic. As we bring our event to a close, I would like to extend an invitation to all of you to remain in touch with YPFP Tokyo and the organizations you've met here today, and consider joining us as members for future events. YPFP Tokyo will be having our annual International Human Rights Conference happening this March on the 25th and 26th of March. We are currently looking for abstract submissions from young scholars and early career researchers with a passion for human rights issues in Japan, Asia, and beyond. Please refer to our website and social media for further information. With that, we will conclude today's dialogue and event. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us here today and all the organizations who helped to make this possible, as well as our speakers and our distinguished guest. YPFP Tokyo will be offering further programming in the realm of security and climate in the future, and I hope that all of you will continue to be a part of our work moving forward. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.